Good evening or good morning if you're Tim. Welcome to the AltDev Student Summit. This is the Day in the Life track, and we are very pleased to present Tim Stobo, who's going to be talking about I Can't Believe I Do This for a Living, the Generalist Game Designer. Underneath your video that you're watching just now, you should see a link that says Ask Questions, or Ask a Question, or something like that, and you can use that to, surprisingly enough, ask a question. If you would like to join in the conversation, you can use the hashtag #AltDevConf, which you can see in the top right corner of the video just now. And in that case, without any further interruptions, I will turn it over to Tim, who will give his presentation.
Cool. Thanks. So yeah, I'm Tim Stobo. I'm going to be talking about my experiences working on LA Noire as a generalist game designer. As soon as I can get these slides to run. There we go. So yeah, I'm Tim Stobo, and I got into games without any sort of technical background. I studied screenwriting at university and only had high school programming and no experience with any sort of 3D software. I'd actually thought I'd never be able to get a job in games, and it sort of completely discounted that. But I just applied to Team Bondi in 2007, and I guess my background with storytelling and my knowledge of games, as in I played too many of them, sort of worked out, and I got the job. So Team Bondi had been founded in 2003 by Brendan McNamara, as you probably know. He just finished work on The Getaway in England and came back to Australia wanting to start his own studio here. It was never actually based in Bondi, but nevertheless, they spent the next 8 years making LA Noire, which ended up selling a bit over 5 million copies and became the fastest selling new IP in the UK. But we were unable to secure a new project, and the studio closed in August of 2011. But it wasn't the end. We were then bought by a company called Kennedy Miller Mitchell, who are a film company responsible for Mad Max and Happy Feet. So this is the team when I started. There were about 40 people back then, and we got up to over 100 at the peak of the project. And this is a photo that I'm not going to point myself out in, but this was what we called a formal Friday, and it was the time I felt I became a member of the team. That is, we dressed up and got really drunk. So the office was a big open plan office where everyone sat in groups of 4, but we didn't sit in teams, so the designers didn't all sit together. We sat maybe a designer, a programmer, an artist, and an animator at a single quad. And this was because all of the designers worked on every aspect of the game. There were no specialists, so we were basically working with any other member of the team at any time. Also, the idea was that designers were seen as sort of the vision holders for the project. They were expected to understand what LA Noire was meant to be and be able to communicate that to the team and to be able to show their enthusiasm to the team and get everyone interested in the game. So because we were generalists, we never really had a single day where you could expect it to be just one thing. You could have had one day where you just worked on level design, or you could have had a day that was split amongst level design, scripting, a review, and some system design. So I'm just going to talk about those 4 things, but it is worth noting that that's never a normal day in the life. We had plenty of other things to do as well. So scripting is a bit of a overcomplication. It was the way we implemented all of the case data. And this was the first job a designer had when they started at Team Bondi. It sort of eased them into the role. So when I started, the tool set hadn't actually finished being developed, so I was able to learn the tools as they were made, which made life a lot easier for me and for all the other designers starting at the time. So when I started, there was no content yet, and so we started working on the unassigned cases. Those were the small bits of sort of incremental gameplay, incidental gameplay, sorry. And the first case I worked on was called Bank Job. This ended up being sort of a big scripted gunfight at a bank in downtown LA. But when I started, we didn't actually have gunfighting. So we first implemented it just getting the bad guys to run around the city, and you had to sort of chase them. But before it got to the point where I could do that, there had already been 4 years of design work done on the game. And most of what those designers had been doing was research. So they'd gone through, I think, 2 years of newspapers from a couple different ones. You can see there's the Los Angeles Herald Express and the Los Angeles Examiner. And they built a database of 11,000 newspaper articles from which we were able to choose the best stories. We can also pull out all sorts of random facts, like there were 97,483 arrests for drunkenness in 1947. But yeah, these research articles turned into the cases, the stories that were told in the game, which means that a lot of the stuff in the game was actually true. The first case in the game, the driver's seat, was based on a true story about a guy who killed a pig in his car to try and fake his own death. He actually showed up again later in the newspapers when he burnt his own house down, again trying to run away from his wife. So after the research had been done, Brendan McNamara, who was the director on the game, would write a script. And after he'd written the script, it would go to a script assistant who would tag it up, like you can see here, so that all of the designers and everyone associated with the case knew exactly what was going on. And then once that had been done, a designer would import the script using a tool we had to create sort of the basic folder structure and the outline for the case. After that had been done, we actually got to the implementation part. So this was our tool. I hope you can see that it's kind of very small text. This was our tool called Attribute Editor, and in this we basically did all of our work implementing and scripting the game. So you can see in the top left there, the highlighted thing says UR006. That was the code for unassigned robbery 6. And on the left-hand side, you can see the folder structure of the case. So we came up with a series of conventions for how we wanted to organize all the data. You can see 01 Bank of America. That was an act. We saw every distinct location as an act in the game, so we could put all of the data underneath that. Unassigned cases tended to just have one act, and assigned cases got up to as many as 13 or 14. On the right-hand side, you can see all of the data associated with the case object, stuff like the line that plays over the radio when the case starts, the type of case it was, and all the different tutorial hints that should have been available. So this is just a simple unassigned case. There are about 280 files in this, and it got to be over 1,500 in the actual assigned cases. So we did sort of all of our work day-to-day scripting in one of these. We could expect to be fixing bugs or implementing conversations or anything like that. But most of the work was done on triggers in the attribute editor. This was as close as we got to having to do anything that actually required programming. So my high school knowledge of all the ands and ors and nots sort of held me in good stead here and meant that I wasn't ever out of my depth, which was really nice. So you can see there we've just got a bunch of conditions checking the health of all the enemies. So we had conditions like this, or conditions that were just checking if the player had walked through a volume. And then under the conditions we would have had all of the actions that were done. The beauty of Attribute Editor was that coders could make anything as complicated as they wanted behind the scenes, but they can just expose only the important bits to the designers. So we could have an action that was as simple as a set state action that just allowed us to turn any type of data on or off in the Attribute Editor. But we could also have something as specific as the spawn pigeons on spline action. And because of the way Attribute Editor worked, designers didn't need to know anything about how either of those things actually worked in the code. We just had to be able to use them in the right place in Attribute Editor. So it allowed us to do complicated things really easily. We also had a world editor. This was mostly used by the artists for populating the world. But you can see here that's the same starting location for the unassigned robbery shootout. But we've got sort of simplified versions of NPCs, simplified versions of cars, and there's the red box there is sort of a trigger volume as displayed there. So we could do all of the same stuff here, but we could see it visually. So it was a more cumbersome tool, but it gave us some interesting abilities to work there. So after we implemented sort of about 100 unassigned cases, we began to move on to assigned cases, which were the big story levels. And at this point, we sort of started to do a little bit more level design. At first, we hadn't really done any. This is a screenshot on the left of Cole Phelps in our LA Noire, and on the right is a movie Shockproof from 1949, in pretty much the same position. And you can see just how accurate we'd made our LA. So because we'd put so much effort into that, there was sort of reluctant for designers to come along and change the world. All of the cases we set up in downtown basically made use of already existing stuff, and we just sort of built the gameplay around that. Our first experience using the level editor actually to do stuff as a level editor was terrible. I had, like I said, no experience in these sort of tools. And the first idea was that designers would create all of the nav mesh for the world, which was how all of the NPCs were able to navigate and how all the player jumps were worked out. So this is basically a mesh that sort of matches the world, but is sort of created over the top and marked up for specific types of materials or for specific sorts of jumps. So designers were pretty much terrible at doing this. Some of us had experience using the tools, but none of us were as good as artists were. So thankfully, this eventually got handed over to them, and even better for the artists, it eventually got automated. So that was my first experience of even using the world editor. But my first experiences of actual level design were to work within spaces the artists had already created, and just to build things within that. So this is a shootout I worked on for one of the DLC cases called Reefer Madness. And here we have a big space in the middle of a soup factory where I was able to place boxes and crates for cover without getting in the way of the functioning soup facility that we'd actually created and that the artists were very proud of. So yeah, I was just working within what had already been created, and this might have been to place clues or to position cover to script a gunfight. And those green boxes, just incidentally, are how NPCs took cover in the game. We placed them there, and then they knew that they were able to take cover. But as we got towards the end of implementing all of the assigned cases, and this is sort of, I think, the end of 2008, we got to cases with much bigger scripted set pieces, whether they be gunfights or car chases or anything like that. And these hadn't really been designed, and there was nowhere in the world for them to take place. So design got a much bigger hand in creating these. So the first one of these that I worked on was for the final case in the game, A Different Kind of War. And it was the final gunfight, and there's spoilers here, I guess, the final gunfight that takes place in the sewer tunnels underneath Los Angeles. So by the time I got to it, artists had already gotten amazing amounts of reference images or had found films like The Third Man that showed sewers, and they were using them for sort of the look of the sewers, whether they be concrete or brick, and the lighting and what sort of textures we might want to find there. So I looked at all these images and then got taught the basics of Maya and created that abomination. It was just lots of featureless tunnels that didn't really make any sense and didn't go anywhere, and I put it in game, and it was absolutely horrible. Turned out that just playing games for a really long time hadn't really taught me everything there was to know about level design, and no amount of leading enemies or dialogue bits could sort of help us out here. So this pretty much got scrapped, and I decided to go back to the reference images and to start just designing single tunnels, whether I wrote them, drew them and wrote them in sketchbooks, or started using, this is in Google SketchUp. This is just one single piece of tunnel that I found an image for that I've since lost. That was sort of a sewer outfall, so the water would flow from the left to the right, whilst the player was trying to move to the right, using all the blocks as cover. So doing this, I was able to create a whole heap of really sort of simplified test tunnels that the artists were then able to make look a hell of a lot better and put in game. So this is the next version of the tunnels level. You can see in the middle at the top is the one I showed you in SketchUp, and then everything else is sort of a gigantic mass of tunnels. At this point, we found after a lot of play testing that the level was really still too long, and so with a lot of reviews and working with some other designers and artists, we went back and we sort of cut out the bits that we didn't think really worked, and we got to another slightly better iteration. So now the room I showed you, the outfall, has been cut completely, but we've got the first look at the big sort of arena in the middle there that remained a feature until the end of production. So here it was a lot better, but it was still pretty complicated. We were trialing the idea of big spaces for gunfights and then small spaces for sort of navigational puzzles. And we were still a little bit unhappy with how long the level was. And you can see on the left-hand side there, there's just a small square. That has remained throughout production. That was where the final cinematic takes place. So you can see that there's still work on what would happen after that. And in this version, which is the final version, the square is still there right next to the much larger arena. And you can see afterwards there are still a whole heap of tunnels that just aren't connected to anything. So even though this was the final version of the LA tunnels, after we'd worked on it for something like 3 years, we still were iterating on it, and we were still trying to get it just the way we wanted, even at the end of production. So at this point, after a whole heap of reviews and lots of working on it, we'd ended up with a much more linear style. We'd basically found all the bits we loved about the gunfight and put them next to each other, instead of having those bits with other less interesting parts in between. So yeah, we'd gone from my first efforts in Maya, just creating long rectangles, to a gunfight that was enormous, and it was fantastic from my point of view anyway. But I might be a little bit biased, and that taught me that you can learn so much from artists. Really, they are there to help designers, and as a generalist, you're not the best at anything, but you can do everything. And so, taking the opportunity to learn from them was really important. So at this point, we've basically implemented all of the content in the game, and this is sort of the end of 2008, the beginning of 2009. So there's still 2 years before the game ended up coming out. And so at this point, we could have spent any day implementing a case or bug fixing or working on the level design for a larger scripted piece. But now that the content was complete, we were going back in and reviewing all of the systems in the game. So we would look at the notebook and decide, if the player finds a clue, should it immediately get put in the notebook? Should everything they find get put in the notebook? Or should nothing they find get put in the notebook? And so we tried a lot of different ways of doing this. And one of the things that ended up happening out of this was we completely redid the conversation system a number of times. But it actually ended up creating some bugs. I think everyone who's played the game is familiar with the fact that sometimes if you are talking to a perfectly nice lady, a nice witness, if you press doubt, the Phelps will sometimes scream his head off at her. This was because we actually had this conversation option was originally titled Force. The idea was that you would actually yell at them, and we even had a mechanic there where you might have hit the person you were questioning from time to time. But because we changed this quite late in production, we'd already started capturing the DA heads, and we didn't have time to go back. So this revision and system design stuff actually did end up causing a few bugs. But I think for the most part, we ended up in a lot better place. So after we'd finished going through all those mechanics, designers were each given an action mechanic to be responsible for. And so I worked with a programmer whose identity I've tried to protect here. And we basically redesigned and rebuilt the mechanic from the ground up to give us much better AI and to give us the ability to script the specific stuff that we felt we needed for the gunfights. So we ended up with a much better system, but I'm sure if we'd had more time, we would have been working on it forever more. So at this point, I was doing a lot of tuning work, and this was actually the most fulfilling stuff I did in the project. I loved working on the system design for gunfighting because I was working in a small team, and we had much more creative control, and we could do exactly what we wanted to do as long as it got the gunfights better. So I did basically all of the tuning. Here you can see, again, I hope that's big enough to read. I was tuning all of the weapon damage for NPCs and for the player, so that at 5 meters it might do this damage, and 10 meters it would do more. I tuned all of the camera stuff, so the recoil when you shot the weapon. I tuned how the AI behaved, how they reacted to fire, how their AI worked. And then I also did implementation of every major gunfight in the game and level design for all of the major set pieces related to gunfights. So at this point, I was really using all of the stuff I'd learned over the last 3 years. And at this point, I'm pretty much the generalist designer where I can work on anything at any time. But that wasn't the end of things. At this point, now that we're content complete and we're all responsible for a mechanic, reviews and testing just got crazy. Obviously, these had been going throughout the project, but at this point, it was hugely important. I think Cliff Bleszinski has a quote about how Gears of War received something like 40,000 hours of testing, but in the first hour, the first level of the game will receive more testing than that just from all the people buying it. So it doesn't matter how often you test it, there's still going to be bugs, and you've got to work as hard as you can to fix those. So we had sort of two systems of reviews. The first reviews was sort of taking our work and showing it to, first maybe you'd get your lead designer to look at it, and then you would go and have a meeting with Brendan McNamara and all of the leads where he would play through a case and he would critique what he didn't like or what didn't work. And in these meetings you could be pretty much guaranteed that if anything was going to break, it would. I can now say I've had gunfighting meetings where shooting didn't work. Those are some of my less favorite meetings to be in. And then after we'd finished doing all the reviews with Brendan and the leads, we would actually have rockstar producers come in. And for a guy with 3 years experience to suddenly have his work critiqued by the guys that make Grand Theft Auto, that was intense, but I learned a hell of a lot. So we would have these meetings and I would come out with piles of bugs to fix, whether they be code bugs or art changes we wanted, in which case I would have to go and talk to all of those guys and get everything done, or just problems in my attribute data or the level design. And again, I would either fix them myself or work with other people to get them done. And that was where the sort of the layout of the office came in really handy, where you can just turn to the guy next to you who's an artist, who's working on your stuff, and just sort of show him what exactly needs to be done. And on your other side, you can talk to the programmer who's working with you, and it made stuff a lot more smooth, and it got everyone really involved. But not everyone was as involved as we would have liked them to be. As the project got to be about 110, 120 people, a lot of whom were artists, there were a lot of people who weren't necessarily gamers, who weren't as into gaming as maybe we would have liked, or as they would have liked even. And they didn't quite understand the game as well as would have been ideal. And so what we started doing was, because everyone was so busy, no one had time to go and play the game. So we started mandating a period every 2 weeks where for half a day everyone would just play the game. We called these peer reviews. This is just a photo I found of that. But it basically meant that for half the day all of the design team was running around with chickens with their heads cut off, trying to show everyone exactly what needed to be done to finish a level. If they got stuck, we'd have to make sure that our stuff wasn't broken, and we'd have to try and guide them to where they needed to be. And this was a huge eye-opener for us. We hadn't realized that perhaps some of our stuff was a little less vague, maybe some clues were too hard to find, or cases were sort of just too hard. And out of reviews like this, we actually ended up with mechanics like the partner hint system, which was built around the idea that you should always be able to ask your partner for help at any time, and you should never be able to get stuck. So we wanted to make the game as accessible as possible. And it was from getting everyone to play the game and watching how they did it that we got towards this point. So yeah, that was pretty much what I was doing as a generalist designer on LA Noire. I started off without any knowledge of game development and started just on really simple implementation of simple gameplay, and moved up to more complicated stuff with the assigned cases, and then was sort of given a hell of a huge task to work on level design, which was an incredibly steep learning curve, but very rewarding. And then started working on system design stuff, whether that be reworking mechanics like conversations or the notebook, or tuning and implementing gunfights across the game. So by the end of the project, as we started getting into reviews, like I say, we were working on pretty much every part of the game, and we were really generalist designers. So in 4 years, I'd gone from never expecting to work in games to working on every aspect of LA Noire, and that's pretty much why I can't believe what I do for a living. It's just insane. So thanks very much. I don't know if Luke is there.
I am here.
Excellent.
Okay, so if anybody has questions for Tim, you can ask them at the link underneath the video. We have got a few minutes for questions still. Unfortunately, nobody has asked anything yet. What seems to be happening is nobody's asking questions during the talks. They're waiting until we start the Q&A session, which means
fair enough.
The first person is usually me to ask a question, and I've usually been doing something else while you've been talking, so it's usually a shit question. But here we go. what would you say is the biggest thing you learned in that whole process?
I think the biggest thing I learned is probably the importance of communication. Like, it's one thing to know how to use the tools. It's another entirely to be able to work with the team around you to get stuff done. Like, no designer can do everything on their own. It doesn't matter how good they are. But if you can explain your ideas to a coder and an artist and an animator, or explain a bug you found or something that just doesn't feel right, that's going to be far better for the game than some gung-ho designer trying to make everything on his own. So I think, yeah, communication is probably the biggest thing I learned.
And we've got a question coming in from Tom. Tom's asking, so this is what you did for LA Noire. You're obviously, you've moved with the rest of the team now. What are you planning on doing next? Is it still very much a generalist role that you have, or did you want to specialize more, or
so at the moment we're in pre-production, so a lot of that stuff that I was talking about there, it doesn't actually apply yet. We can't, do content creation because we haven't figured out what content we want to create. So now I'm actually sort of much more specialized. I work more as a systems designer now. And I said in that talk that was some of the most rewarding stuff I'd done on LA Noire. So being able to come in at the beginning of a project now and do all the same stuff, but from the very beginning is awesome.
Great. Okay, we don't seem to have any more. Oh, no.
Oh.
Okay, so for someone who tends to be more of a generalist designer, what would you recommend to be an effective method of getting started and learning new things? So I guess not everybody can just sign on to LA Noire and get...
Yeah, no, I got pretty lucky there. I guess what I've been doing now to try and improve my own skills has been, just signing up to things like Code Academy and learning to code there, or just messing around with game development tools. I guess if you are a generalist like me, the best way to do it, if you don't feel you can start out on some big project, would be to get involved with modding, even if it's just offering feedback on someone else's work. If you do that enough, people will start offering to show you the ropes, and you can start actually doing game dev stuff that way. Alternatively, if you're like me and had a background in writing, I know there are a lot of indies in Sydney who don't have any background in writing. So going along to IGDA meetups and stuff and just sort of offering your services and then listening to everything they say and learning as much as you can after that is probably a good way to go.
Awesome. Let me just check if there are any more. Okay, this is quite an interesting one. How much of what you expected in terms of your job ended up being what you did? What was the biggest surprise when you came in?
I guess the tuning. Like, you have this vision of, like, one of my heroes was John Romero, and you hear about how they made Doom, and they're creating all the levels, and then they're scripting all the levels, and you see footage of behind the scenes looks at games where they're showing you the 3D editing tools and all that sort of stuff. But what surprised me was that once that's created, you can spend forever just changing tiny little numbers and getting a completely different result. The amount of time I spent tuning how the player's camera reacts when you fire each sort of gun, or the damage a weapon does at 15 meters instead of 10 meters, like, that was a huge amount of work, and I had never really considered that there was that much tuning involved in game development. It just sort of seemed like once it's done, it's done, but there's a lot more depth than that.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Tim. That's a great session.
No, thank you.
So, for those of you who are staying with us, we are about to start up with 2 sessions that I had in front of me and now don't. So we've got A Day in the Life of a Games Writer by Anne Toole starting up now, and we also have Starting and Running a Company from a Programmer's Perspective by Rebecca Fernandez. They'll be up and running in the next couple of minutes, so stay with us. Thanks again to Tim, and we'll catch you in a couple of minutes.